The crack of gunfire echoed across the windswept prairie as Grace Kelly dove behind an overturned wagon, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. Her once pristine blue dress was now torn and stained with the red dust of the Arizona Territory, a stark reminder of the life she'd left behind in Boston. The year was 1876, and she had come west with dreams that had quickly turned to nightmares in the hands of Frank Blackburn, the man who had promised her a new life but delivered only cruelty. Grace pressed her palm against her side where a fresh bruise throbbed, evidence of Frank's temper when she'd announced her intention to leave him. 3 months of marriage had been enough to show her the truth of his character. The man who courted her back east was merely a facade hiding a monster who believed a wife was property to be controlled. She'd endured his fists, his words, his degradation, but no more. Another shot splintered the wood near her head, sending fragments flying. Frank's drunken voice carried across the distance. "You think you can run from me, woman? You belong to me." Grace clutched the small bag containing the few possessions she'd managed to grab. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she glanced frantically across the open land, searching for an escape route. The trading post was only 2 miles away. If she could reach it, perhaps someone would help her. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her blood freeze. Frank had mounted his horse. She wouldn't outrun him on foot. This was it. Her desperate bid for freedom was about to end before it truly began, but the hoofbeats weren't coming from Frank's direction. From the east, a cloud of dust rose as a rider approached at a gallop. Grace squinted against the setting sun, making out the silhouette of a man on horseback. For a moment, she considered hiding, fearful this newcomer might be one of Frank's drinking companions. The rider drew closer, and Grace saw he was a stranger tall and broad-shouldered atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. He wore the practical garb of a cattleman, worn denim, leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He reined his horse to a stop between Grace and Frank, dust swirling around him like a protective cloak. "That's far enough," the stranger called out, his voice deep and steady as he addressed Frank. "The lady doesn't appear to want your company." Frank staggered forward, his rifle wavering in his unsteady hands. "Mind your own business, mister. That's my wife, and she's coming home." The stranger didn't flinch. "Madam," he asked without turning, keeping his eyes trained on Frank. Grace rose shakily to her feet. "He's my husband, but I'm leaving him. He'll kill me if I go back." The stranger nodded once, then addressed Frank again. "You heard the lady. She's not going anywhere with you." "Who the hell do you think you are?" Frank spat, raising his rifle. In one fluid motion, the stranger drew his revolver. "Someone who doesn't take kindly to men who threaten women. Now lower that rifle before I put a hole in you." For a tense moment, Grace thought Frank might shoot anyway. Then, muttering curses, he lowered his weapon. "This ain't over," he snarled. "She's my property by law." "Not anymore," the stranger replied. "Ride away, mister. Don't come back." Frank's face contorted with rage, but something in the stranger's steady gaze made him reconsider. With a final venomous glare at Grace, he turned his horse and rode back toward their homestead. Only when Frank had disappeared over the horizon did the stranger holster his weapon and turn to face Grace. His features were weathered by sun and wind, but not unkind. A day's growth of beard shadowed his jaw, and his eyes were a startling blue against his tanned skin. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, dismounting. Grace shook her head, though her entire body ached from Frank's earlier assault. "Nothing that won't heal. Thank you for your intervention, mister." "Samuel Mitchell," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Most folks just call me Sam." "Grace Kelly," she offered, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. "I was heading for the trading post at Cottonwood Creek." Sam nodded. "That's still a fair piece away, and night's coming on fast." He glanced at the horizon where the sun was sinking in a blaze of orange and crimson. "My ranch is closer. You'd be welcome to take shelter there for the night." Grace hesitated. Trading one man's company for another's seemed risky, but there was something in Sam's direct gaze that inspired trust rather than fear. "He won't give up easily," she said. "Frank, I mean, he's not the kind to let go of what he considers his." "Then all the more reason not to be out in the open," Sam replied. He gestured to his horse. "Can you ride?" Grace nodded. She'd learned as a girl back in Massachusetts, though it had been years. Sam extended his hand, and after only a moment's hesitation, Grace took it. His palm was calloused but his grip gentle as he helped her mount. He swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance while still providing support. "Hold tight to the saddle horn," he instructed, and clicked his tongue to set the horse in motion. As they rode away from the site of her failed escape, Grace felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension. She had run from one situation directly into another, with no clear plan beyond the immediate need to get away from Frank. Yet for the first time in months, she felt a fragile hope taking root. Whether that hope was justified remained to be seen. The Mitchell Ranch came into view just as dusk was settling over the landscape, a sturdy main house, barn, corral, and a few outbuildings nestled in a valley with a creek winding through it. It wasn't grand, but it spoke of care and hard work. "It's not much," Sam said, almost apologetically, "but it's mine, paid for free and clear last year." "It looks wonderful," Grace replied truthfully. After months in a crude one-room cabin with Frank, the Mitchell Ranch looked like paradise. As they approached, a young man emerged from the barn, waving. "That's Joseph," Sam explained. "My ranch hand. Good kid, works hard." Joseph jogged over as they dismounted. He was perhaps 19 with sandy hair and a friendly face. "Evening, boss," he said, then noticed Grace. His eyes widened slightly, but he managed a polite nod. "Madam." "Joseph, this is Mrs. Kelly," Sam said. "She'll be our guest tonight." If Joseph was curious about the sudden appearance of a disheveled woman at the ranch, he kept it to himself. "I'll take care of Thunder," he offered, taking the reins of Sam's horse. "Thank you, Joseph." Sam turned to Grace. "Let's get you inside. You look about ready to drop." Grace couldn't argue with that assessment. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation with Frank was fading, leaving her exhausted and sore. The interior of the main house was simple but comfortable, a large room serving as both kitchen and living area, with doors leading to what Grace assumed were bedrooms. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, taking the chill off the spring evening. "Have a seat," Sam offered, gesturing to a wooden chair at the table. "I'll fix us some supper." Grace sank gratefully into the chair. "I can help," she protested weakly. Sam shook his head. "Rest. You've had a rough day by the looks of it." She watched as he moved efficiently around the kitchen, putting coffee on to boil and retrieving food from a cupboard. There was nothing awkward or uncertain about his movements. Clearly he was accustomed to caring for himself. "How long have you been out here?" she asked, breaking the silence. 5 years on my own," Sam replied, slicing bread. "Came west with my brother after the war. He didn't take to ranching, headed to California last year. Before that, we worked our father's farm in Missouri." "The war," Grace murmured. Sam would have been young but old enough to fight. "You served," a shadow crossed his face. "Union cavalry, 4 years that felt like 40. Grace nodded, not pressing further. Everyone had their wounds from that terrible conflict. "And you?" Sam asked, changing the subject. "You don't sound like you're from these parts." "Boston," Grace confirmed. "I came west 3 months ago to marry Frank. We had corresponded for nearly a year before that." Sam's expression darkened. "Mail-order bride," Grace flinched at the term. "Not exactly. Frank was in Boston on business. We met at a social function. He was charming, attentive, said he had a ranch in Arizona Territory. It wasn't until after the wedding that I learned the ranch was 40 acres of scrubland with a falling-down cabin, and the business was whatever scheme he could think up." She touched her cheek unconsciously where a bruise had just faded. "The drinking and the violence started soon after we arrived. Today wasn't the first time I tried to leave. It was just the first time I made it further than the front door." Sam placed a bowl of stew in front of her, his expression grim. "Men like that are a stain on the territory." He sat down across from her with his own bowl. "What will you do now?" Grace stared into the steaming stew, suddenly aware of how limited her options were. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have a little money saved, perhaps enough for a stagecoach ticket to Tucson. I could find work there." "Doing what?" "I was a teacher in Boston," she said. "Perhaps I could teach here as well." Sam nodded thoughtfully. "Cottonwood Creek's growing. They might be looking for a school teacher." He hesitated. "But your husband, Frank," Grace interjected firmly. "I don't consider him my husband anymore." "Frank," Sam amended. "He'll come looking for you. Men like him don't let go easily." Grace felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. "I know." They ate in silence for a moment, then Sam spoke again. Stay here for a few days, get your bearings, rest up. I'll ride into town tomorrow, find out if anyone's hiring a teacher. Maybe talk to Sheriff Donovan about your situation. Grace looked up, surprised at the offer. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Sam's blue eyes held her steadily. My mother left my father when I was 12. He was a lot like your Frank. She didn't have anyone to help her. He glanced away, his jaw tightening. She didn't make it. The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken pain. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. Sam nodded once, acknowledgement rather than acceptance. The spare room's yours for as long as you need it, no strings. Grace felt tears threatening. After months of living with Frank's manipulation and cruelty, Sam's straightforward kindness was almost overwhelming. Thank you. After supper, Sam showed her to a small but clean bedroom. Bathroom's out back, he explained. There's a lock on both doors. I'll bring water for washing up. When he returned with a pitcher and basin, he also carried a bundle of cloth. These were my sister-in-law's. She left them when they moved west. Might be more comfortable than what you're wearing. Grace accepted the simple dress and nightgown gratefully. Your brother's wife, Sam nodded. Martha, she was about your size, said these weren't practical enough for California. A slight smile touched his lips. Martha's practical to her bones. After Sam left, Grace changed into the nightgown, wincing as she moved. In the privacy of the bedroom, she examined her injuries, bruises on her ribs and back from Frank's last beating, scrapes on her palms from falling when she ran. Nothing life-threatening, but painful reminders of what she'd escaped. She washed her face and hands, then sat on the edge of the bed, reality settling heavily upon her. She was alone in a territory far from home with no money to speak of, a violent husband likely searching for her, and nowhere to go. The enormity of her situation threatened to crush her. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Kelly, Sam called softly. Yes, she answered, quickly wiping away tears. There's extra blankets in the chest if you get cold, and don't worry about getting up early, rest as long as you need. The simple consideration nearly undid her composure again. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell, Sam, he corrected. Sleep well, Mrs. Kelly. Grace, she offered in return. Good night, Sam. She heard his footsteps retreat and lay down on the bed, expecting sleep to elude her. But exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, drawing her into a deep, dreamless rest, the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. Grace woke to sunlight streaming through the small window and the aroma of coffee. For a disorienting moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day rushed back, and she sat up quickly, wincing at the protest from her bruised ribs. The simple dress Sam had provided fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in the waist. Grace did her best to make herself presentable, though without a proper bath and her hairbrush lost in her hasty departure. It was a challenge. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Sam at the stove, frying bacon. He glanced up and nodded a greeting. Morning, coffee's hot. Thank you. Grace poured herself a cup, grateful for the normalcy of the moment. Joseph's already fed the horses, Sam said. I'll head to town after breakfast, see what I can find out about teaching positions. He glanced at her. Anything you need from town, Grace hesitated. Perhaps a hairbrush. And some personal items. Her cheeks warmed at having to ask. Sam nodded, showing no sign of embarrassment. Make a list. Martha left some paper and pencils in the desk drawer over there. As Grace wrote, Sam brought plates of bacon, eggs, and biscuits to the table. The simple food reminded her that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Frank's drinking had left little money for food, and what there was usually went to him first. This is wonderful, she said sincerely between bites. You're quite the cook. Sam smiled slightly. When you live alone, you learn or you starve. My mother taught me the basics before. He trailed off, then continued more briskly. The rest I figured out by trial and error, mostly error according to Joseph. After breakfast, Grace insisted on washing the dishes while Sam prepared to ride to Cottonwood Creek. She watched through the window as he saddled Thunder, his movements efficient and practiced. Joseph appeared from the direction of the barn, saying something that made Sam laugh. The young ranch hand glanced toward the house, caught Grace watching, and quickly looked away, a flush visible even at a distance. Sam said something else to Joseph, clapped him on the shoulder, and mounted his horse. As he rode away, Grace felt a peculiar mixture of anxiety and relief. Part of her feared being left behind. Another part welcomed the chance to collect her thoughts without Sam's quiet, observant presence. With nothing else to occupy her, Grace set about cleaning the already tidy house. She found a broom and swept the floors, washed the windows, and even reorganized the pantry. The simple tasks kept her mind from dwelling on Frank or the precariousness of her situation. Outside, she occasionally glimpsed Joseph working with the horses or mending a fence. He seemed to be deliberately staying away from the house, perhaps uncomfortable with her presence. Grace didn't mind, she'd had enough of men's attention to last a lifetime. Around noon, she heard hoofbeats approaching and tensed, fear instantly resurfacing. But it was only Joseph, riding in from checking the cattle. He nodded awkwardly to her as he passed the house. Grace decided to attempt communication. She stepped onto the porch. "Joseph, would you like some lunch? I was just about to make something." The young man hesitated, clearly torn between hunger and shyness. "Don't want to be no trouble, madam." "It's no trouble," Grace assured him. "It's the least I can do to repay Mr. Mitchell's hospitality." Joseph finally nodded and followed her inside, removing his hat and standing awkwardly just inside the door until Grace gestured him to the table. As she prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold meat, she attempted conversation. "Have you worked for Mr. Mitchell long?" 2 years come July, Joseph replied. "Best boss I ever had. He seems like a good man." Joseph nodded vigorously. "The best. Gave me a job when nobody else would. I was just a kid with no experience, but Mr. Mitchell, he said everybody deserves a chance to prove themselves." He accepted the plate Grace offered. "Thank you, madam. You can call me Grace," she said, sitting down with her own plate. "Yes, madam, I mean Miss Grace." Joseph focused intently on his food, clearly uncomfortable with the familiarity. "Mr. Mitchell mentioned he came west with his brother," Grace said. "Does his family visit often?" Joseph shook his head. "His brother and sister-in-law moved on to California. Don't think they write much. Mr. Mitchell doesn't talk about family except his mother sometimes." Grace nodded, understanding the reluctance to discuss painful subjects. "And what about your family, Joseph?" "Dead," the young man said matter-of-factly. "Fever took them when I was 14, been on my own since." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. Joseph shrugged. "It's the way of things out here, you lose people." He looked up, sudden concern in his eyes. "Are you really running from your husband, madam? Mr. Mitchell said to keep an eye out in case he comes looking." Grace set down her fork. "Yes, my husband is not a kind man." Joseph nodded solemnly. "We'll watch out for you, madam, Mr. Mitchell and me." "Thank you, Joseph." Grace felt a surge of gratitude toward this earnest young man and his employer. After lunch, Joseph returned to his chores and Grace was once again left with her thoughts. She wandered out to the porch, breathing in the clean, dry air of the Arizona territory. The land stretched out before her, harsh and beautiful in equal measure. In the distance, mountains rose blue against the sky. It was nothing like the crowded streets and proper gardens of Boston, yet there was something compelling about this wild place. If circumstances had been different, if Frank had been the man he pretended to be, she might have grown to love it here. The sound of an approaching rider pulled Grace from her reverie. She tensed, ready to flee inside, but then recognized Sam's tall figure on Thunder's back. Relief washed over her, stronger than she expected. Sam dismounted in front of the house, removing his hat as he approached the porch. His expression was unreadable. "Did you learn anything?" Grace asked, unable to contain her anxiety. "Some good news, some not so good," Sam replied, joining her on the porch. "The school in Cottonwood Creek has been looking for a teacher. The last one left 2 months ago to get married. The town council's willing to meet with you day after tomorrow." Hope flared in Grace's chest. "That's wonderful." "The not-so-good news is that your husband Frank, he's been asking around town for you. Told folks you're unstable and ran off during an episode." Grace's hope dimmed. "And they believed him." "Some did," Sam acknowledged. "Frank Blackburn has friends in Cottonwood Creek. He's been working a mining claim with some partners. They're not the most reputable bunch, but they've been bringing money into town." "What does this mean for me?" Grace asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Sam's blue eyes met hers directly. "It means we need to be careful. I spoke with Sheriff Donovan. He's a good man, but there's not much he can do legally. In the eyes of the law, you're still Frank's wife. Grace clenched her hands in the folds of her borrowed dress. So I'm supposed to go back to him, let him beat me until he kills me? No, Sam said firmly. That's not going to happen, but we need to be smart about this. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package. I got the things you asked for, and I spoke to Reverend Hayes's wife. She's willing to lend you some clothes until you get settled. Thank you, Grace said, taking the package. But what about the teaching position if Frank has been spreading lies about me? Not everyone believes him, Sam assured her. Especially the women. Frank's reputation with the ladies isn't the best. He hesitated. Mrs. Hayes suggested that perhaps you should speak with her husband about annulment possibilities. Grace blinked in surprise. Annulment. Is that even possible? Reverend Hayes seems to think there might be grounds, something about fraud if Frank misrepresented himself before the marriage. A spark of hope rekindled in Grace's heart. That would change everything, Sam nodded. We'll visit them tomorrow. For now, I think it's best if you stay here. Frank's been drinking heavily in town, no telling what he might do if he finds you. As if to punctuate his words, the distant sound of galloping hooves reached them. Sam tensed, hand moving instinctively to his holstered revolver. But it was only Joseph, riding in from the north pasture. The young man reined his horse to a stop, face flushed with exertion. Mr. Mitchell, riders coming from the east, 5 of them looked like Frank Blackburn and his mining partners. Sam's expression hardened. How far? Maybe 20 minutes out, Joseph replied. I cut across the ridge when I spotted them. Sam turned to Grace. Get inside, go to the bedroom and stay there. Fear gripped Grace's throat. Sam, I should leave. I don't want to bring trouble to your home. It's too late for that, he replied grimly. Besides, I've handled worse than Frank Blackburn and his drunken friends. He nodded to Joseph. Get the rifle from the barn and make sure all the horses are secure. As Joseph hurried to comply, Sam guided Grace firmly toward the house. Lock the bedroom door. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Sam. Grace began, but words failed her. His expression softened slightly. It's going to be all right, Grace. I promise you that. In the bedroom, Grace paced anxiously, stopping occasionally to peer through the window. She could hear the men's voices outside but couldn't make out what they were saying. The only clear sound was the pounding of her heart, minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then came the sound she dreaded, Frank's voice, loud and slurred with drink. I know she's here, Mitchell. Send her out now and we won't have any trouble. Grace couldn't hear Sam's response, but Frank's angry retort was clear enough. She's my wife. The law says she belongs to me. More muffled conversation followed, then a sudden commotion, shouts, the sound of scuffling, a gunshot. Grace gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth to stifle a scream. Another shot rang out, followed by the thunder of hooves. Were they leaving, or had someone fallen? The uncertainty was unbearable. Then came a knock at the bedroom door. Grace. It was Sam's voice, strained but steady. It's safe now. She fumbled with the lock, hands shaking, and pulled the door open. Sam stood there, a cut on his cheek bleeding slowly but otherwise intact. Are you hurt? She asked, reaching up instinctively to touch the wound. Sam caught her hand gently. I'm fine, just a scratch. He released her and stepped back. Frank and his friends have gone for now. What happened? Sam's jaw tightened. Frank tried to force his way in. When I stopped him, one of his friends pulled a gun. Joseph fired a warning shot, and they decided discretion was the better part of valor. They'll be back, Grace said, the brief relief already fading. Probably, Sam agreed, but not tonight. They were headed toward town and they were already drunk. By morning they'll be nursing hangovers. I can't stay here, Grace insisted. I'm putting you and Joseph in danger. You're not going anywhere tonight, Sam said firmly. Tomorrow we'll go see Reverend Hayes as planned. After that, we'll figure it out. His calm assurance should have been comforting, but Grace couldn't shake the image of Sam facing down Frank and his armed friends, all because of her. Why are you doing this? Taking these risks for someone you barely know? Sam was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intent. Because I know what it's like to be trapped, to feel there's no way out. His blue eyes held hers. And because no one deserves to live in fear, Grace. No one. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a connection that went beyond words. Grace felt herself trembling, though whether from residual fear or from the intensity of Sam's gaze, she couldn't say. Then Joseph called from outside, breaking the spell. Sam stepped back, his expression returning to its usual reserve. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." But rest proved elusive for Grace that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind set her nerves jangling. When she did drift off, her dreams were haunted by Frank's rage-contorted face and the sound of gunfire. She woke before dawn, exhausted but too anxious to remain in bed. Quietly, she made her way to the kitchen, intending to start breakfast as a small way of repaying Sam's kindness. To her surprise, she found him already there, coffee brewing on the stove. He looked up as she entered, and Grace realized he likely hadn't slept either. The cut on his cheek had scabbed over, adding to the weariness of his appearance. "You're up early," he observed. "I couldn't sleep," Grace admitted. "I thought I might make breakfast." Sam gestured to the stove. "Help yourself, Joseph won't be up for another hour." As Grace set about preparing the meal, they fell into a companionable silence. There was something soothing about the domestic routine, the sizzle of bacon in the pan, the rhythmic motion of kneading biscuit dough, the rich aroma of coffee filling the kitchen. "You're good at that," Sam commented as she expertly rolled out the dough. "Cooking, I mean," Grace smiled slightly. "My mother insisted I learn, though we had a cook at home. She said a proper lady should know how to run a household, even if she never had to do the work herself." "Wise woman," Sam said, refilling his coffee cup. "Is she still in Boston?" "She passed away 5 years ago," Grace replied. "My father followed a year later. I was teaching at a girls' school when I met Frank." She paused, hands stilling on the rolling pin. "They would be horrified to see where I've ended up." Sam studied her for a moment. "I don't know about that. You had the courage to leave a bad situation." "Not everyone does. Running away isn't courage," Grace said softly. "Sometimes it is," Sam countered. "Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do." Their gazes met across the kitchen, and once again Grace felt that curious connection, as if Sam saw something in her that she couldn't see in herself. The day passed in a flurry of preparation. Sam insisted they wait until afternoon to visit Cottonwood Creek, reasoning that Frank and his friends would be at their mining claim by then. Joseph would stay behind to watch the ranch and warn them if trouble approached. Grace washed her hair and borrowed one of Martha's dresses, a modest navy blue that fit her reasonably well. Sam had procured a hairbrush in town, allowing her to feel somewhat presentable for the first time since her escape. They set out just after midday, Grace riding a gentle mare named Daisy while Sam led the way on Thunder. The journey to town took about an hour, during which Grace alternated between anxiety about encountering Frank and nervous anticipation about meeting the Reverend and his wife. Cottonwood Creek was small by Eastern standards, but substantial for a territorial settlement, a main street lined with wooden buildings, a few side streets with modest homes, and a white steepled church on a slight rise at the north end of town. Sam led them directly to the church, where a woman was tending a small garden. She straightened as they approached, shading her eyes against the sun. "Mrs. Hayes," Sam called, dismounting and helping Grace down from Daisy. "This is Mrs. Grace Kelly, the lady I mentioned." Elizabeth Hayes was a plump, pleasant-faced woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Welcome, Mrs. Kelly. My husband is expecting you." She clasped Grace's hands warmly. "Don't worry, my dear, you're among friends now." The parsonage attached to the church was small but immaculate, with polished furniture and hand-stitched cushions giving it a homey feel. Reverend Hayes rose from his desk as they entered, a tall, thin man with silver-streaked dark hair and a scholarly demeanor. "Mrs. Kelly," he greeted her, offering his hand. "I've been expecting you. Samuel has told us something of your situation." Grace glanced at Sam, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she began her story, meeting Frank in Boston, his charm and promises, the disillusionment upon arriving in Arizona, and finally the violence that drove her to flee. The Reverend listened gravely, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing Grace to speak uninterrupted. When she finished, he sat back with a thoughtful expression. "Your situation is indeed serious, Mrs. Kelly," he said at last. "Both morally and legally complex. Can anything be done?" Grace asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. "Perhaps," Reverend Hayes replied cautiously. "If Mr. Blackburn knowingly misrepresented himself before the marriage, claiming properties and businesses he did not possess, there might be grounds for annulment. However, proving such fraud would be difficult, especially since the marriage has been consummated. He glanced away delicately at this last point. Grace felt her cheeks warm but pressed on. What evidence would be needed? Witnesses who could testify to his claims versus the reality. Documentation of his actual holdings at the time of your marriage. The Reverend spread his hands. It's not impossible, but it would take time, and unfortunately, until an annulment or divorce is granted, legally you remain his wife. And legally, I'm his property, Grace said bitterly. The law grants husbands considerable authority, Reverend Hayes acknowledged, but not the right to abuse. Sheriff Donovan would intervene if Mr. Blackburn threatened violence. By then it might be too late, Sam interjected, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the parsonage. Mrs. Hayes, who had been quietly arranging tea, nodded in agreement. The law offers little protection for women in Mrs. Kelly's situation. That's why we sometimes must rely on other means. Her husband gave her a warning look. Elizabeth. Oh, hush, Thomas, Mrs. Hayes said fondly. I'm not suggesting anything improper. But there is the school position to consider. She turned to Grace. The town council is quite desperate for a teacher. The children have been without proper instruction for months. If you were to accept the position, you would have the support of many families in Cottonwood Creek, families with influence. How would that help me with Frank? Grace asked. Community standing matters out here, Sam explained. If you're respected as the school teacher, it would be harder for Frank to force you to return without causing a stir. And, Mrs. Hayes added, the teaching position comes with accommodations, the small house behind the schoolhouse. You would have your own home, independence. Hope stirred in Grace's heart. When could I meet with the council? Tomorrow afternoon, Reverend Hayes said. I serve on the council and can arrange it. Many members are eager to fill the position before the harvest season ends and more children can attend. In the meantime, Mrs. Hayes added, You're welcome to stay with us. We have a spare room. Grace glanced at Sam, uncertain. He had already done so much for her. She couldn't expect him to continue providing sanctuary. Yet the thought of not returning to the ranch with him caused an unexpected pang. Sam seemed to read her thoughts. It might be safer here, he said quietly. Frank knows to look for you at my place. That's settled then, Mrs. Hayes said briskly. You'll stay with us until your meeting with the council. Samuel, will you join us for dinner before you ride back? Sam shook his head. Thank you, madam, but I should get back to the ranch. Joseph will be wondering what's happened. He turned to Grace. I'll come by tomorrow to accompany you to the council meeting. Grace felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and something deeper she wasn't ready to examine. Thank you, Sam, for everything. His blue eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. You're welcome, Grace. After Sam departed, Mrs. Hayes showed Grace to the spare room, a small but comfortable space with a narrow bed, washstand, and window overlooking the church garden. The older woman's kindness was overwhelming after months of Frank's cruelty, and Grace found herself blinking back tears as Mrs. Hayes fussed over fresh linens and a borrowed nightgown. There now, Mrs. Hayes said gently, noticing Grace's emotion. You're safe here, my dear. Thomas and I will make sure of that. You hardly know me, Grace said, echoing what she'd said to Sam. Why would you take such risks? Mrs. Hayes patted her hand. Because it's the right thing to do, and because Samuel Mitchell wouldn't have brought you to us if you weren't worth helping. She smiled knowingly. Samuel doesn't trust easily, you know, not since the war. The fact that he's taken up your cause says a great deal. Grace felt a flutter in her chest at these words. He's been very kind. More than kind, I'd say, Mrs. Hayes observed with a twinkle in her eye. I haven't seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you since. Well, since before Jenny broke his heart. Jenny, Grace couldn't help asking, his sweetheart before the war, she married someone else while he was away fighting. Mrs. Hayes shook her head. Broke the poor boy. He came west to start fresh, but as far as I know, he's kept to himself these past 5 years. She patted Grace's hand again. Until now, the implication hung in the air between them. Grace felt her cheeks warm. Mrs. Hayes, I've only just escaped one marriage. I'm hardly looking for another. Of course not, dear, Mrs. Hayes agreed, though her smile suggested she thought otherwise. Now let's see about finding you something more comfortable to wear. Those clothes of Martha Mitchell's are rather severe for your coloring. The next day passed in a blur of preparation for the council meeting. Mrs. Hayes insisted on lending Grace her second-best dress, a becoming sage green that complemented Grace's auburn hair far better than Martha's navy blue. Reverend Hayes coached her on what to expect from the council members, particularly the more conservative ones who might question a separated woman teaching their children. By the time Sam arrived to escort her to the meeting, Grace's nerves were stretched taut as piano wire. He looked different today, freshly shaved, wearing a clean shirt and vest rather than his usual work clothes. The transformation emphasized his handsome features, making Grace suddenly conscious of her own appearance. "You look nice," Sam said, evidently having similar thoughts. "Green suits you." "Thank you," Grace replied, feeling oddly flustered. "Mrs. Hayes lent me the dress. Are you ready?" he asked. "The council's waiting at the schoolhouse." Grace nodded, though her stomach was churning with anxiety. "As ready as I'll ever be." The schoolhouse stood near the center of town, a simple one-room building with a small bell tower and attached living quarters at the back. Inside, 6 people sat at the children's desks, an incongruous sight that might have been comical under different circumstances. Reverend Hayes made the introductions. Mr. Peterson, the general store owner, Mrs. Rodriguez, mother of 5 and wife of a successful rancher, Mr. Whitaker, the bank manager, Miss Collins, an unmarried lady of a certain age who had taught at the school years earlier, Mr. Thompson, a gruff cattle rancher, and Sheriff Donovan, who apparently served on every committee in Cottonwood Creek. Grace stood before them and explained her qualifications, her education at a women's seminary in Massachusetts, her 3 years teaching at a girls' school in Boston. She answered questions about her teaching philosophy, her experience with different age groups, and her willingness to adapt to the territorial school curriculum. Throughout, she felt Sam's steady presence at the back of the room, a silent support that gave her courage when difficult questions arose. "Mrs. Kelly," Mr. Whitaker said eventually, "we must address the matter of your domestic situation. It's come to our attention that you've recently separated from your husband under contentious circumstances." Grace took a deep breath. "Yes, Mr. Whitaker, that's correct. My husband and I are estranged due to his violent behavior toward me. I am pursuing an annulment through proper legal channels." "Annulments are rarely granted," Mr. Thompson pointed out gruffly, "and until then, you remain Mrs. Blackburn in the eyes of the law." "I prefer to use my maiden name, Kelly," Grace replied steadily. "The point is," Mr. Thompson continued, "that we must consider the example set for our children. A woman abandoning her marriage vows—" "Thomas," Mrs. Rodriguez interrupted sharply. "Let us be clear about what we're discussing. Mrs. Kelly fled an abusive situation. Are you suggesting she should have remained to be beaten or worse?" Mr. Thompson had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Of course not, Maria, but there are proper channels that offer little protection to women," Mrs. Rodriguez retorted. "I, for one, would rather our children learn from a teacher with the courage to stand up for herself than from someone who accepts mistreatment as her lot in life." A murmur of agreement came from Miss Collins and, surprisingly, Sheriff Donovan. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Whitaker exchanged glances, clearly reconsidering their positions. "Perhaps," Reverend Hayes suggested diplomatically, "we should focus on Mrs. Kelly's qualifications as a teacher. On that score, I believe we can all agree she is more than adequate." The council members nodded, and the conversation returned to safer topics: salary meager but livable, duties extensive, and starting date as soon as possible. By the end of the hour, Grace had been officially offered the position of schoolteacher for Cottonwood Creek, with the attached living quarters included as part of her compensation. She accepted with a mixture of relief and trepidation. This was her chance at independence, but it also meant staying in the same town as Frank. As the council members filed out, offering congratulations and welcome, Sam approached. "Congratulations, Miss Kelly," he said formally, mindful of the lingering council members. "Cottonwood Creek is fortunate to have you." "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," Grace replied with equal formality. "I couldn't have done this without your help." Once they were alone, save for Reverend Hayes gathering his papers, Sam's manner relaxed. "You were impressive in there." "They didn't stand a chance." Grace laughed softly. "I think Mrs. Rodriguez was the deciding factor. She's quite formidable." One of the most respected women in the territory, Sam agreed. Her support will matter if Frank tries to cause trouble. The mention of Frank sobered them both. Reverend Hayes, overhearing, joined the conversation. I've spoken with Judge Wilson about your case, Mrs. Kelly. He's willing to hear evidence for an annulment when he returns from the circuit in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Grace repeated. It seemed both too soon and not soon enough. In the meantime, Sam said, you'll need to move into the teacher's quarters and prepare for classes to begin. Reverend Hayes nodded. The previous teacher left most of the school materials in good order. Mrs. Hayes and some of the other ladies will help you settle in. When can I move in? Grace asked. Today, if you wish, Reverend Hayes replied. The quarters have been empty but maintained. They'll need a good cleaning, but they're livable. Grace felt a surge of determination. This small house would be her first true home in the territory, a place that belonged to her by virtue of her own merit rather than through dependency on a man. Today, then, with Sam and the Hayeses' help, Grace moved into the teacher's quarters that afternoon. The small house consisted of 2 rooms, a combined kitchen and living area, and a bedroom. Simple furnishings had been provided by the town: a bed, table, chairs, and a small bookshelf. Mrs. Hayes contributed linens and kitchenware on indefinite loan, while Sam brought a rocking chair from his ranch that had belonged to his sister-in-law. Martha would want you to have it, he insisted when Grace protested. She always said every home needs a place to sit and think. By evening, the little house had begun to feel like a home. Grace stood in the center of the main room, surveying their work with satisfaction. I can't thank you all enough, she said to the Hayeses and Sam. A week ago, I had no hope, no future. Now I have both. You've earned this, Mrs. Hayes said warmly. Now we should let you rest. Tomorrow we'll be busy. The mothers are bringing their children to meet you, and we need to finalize preparations for classes to begin on Monday. After the Hayeses departed, Sam lingered, seeming reluctant to leave. Will you be all right here alone? He asked. Frank's still out there. The sheriff promised to keep an eye on the schoolhouse, Grace reminded him, and as Mrs. Rodriguez pointed out, I now have the support of many families in town. Sam nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. I'll be in town for supplies tomorrow. I could stop by, make sure everything's all right. The thought of seeing him again lifted Grace's spirits more than she cared to admit. I'd like that. An awkward silence fell between them, laden with unspoken thoughts. Sam broke it first. I should go, it'll be dark soon. Of course, Grace said, walking him to the door. Thank you again, Sam, for everything. He hesitated at the threshold, then reached out to touch her cheek lightly, a gesture so brief and gentle that Grace might have imagined it if not for the warmth that lingered on her skin. Good night, Grace, he said softly, and then he was gone, leaving her standing in the doorway with her heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Grace met the families of Cottonwood Creek, learned the names of 37 children ranging from 6 to 16 years old, and prepared her first week of lessons. The work was exhausting but exhilarating, a return to the teaching she loved, now with the added dimension of independence. Sam visited daily, ostensibly to check on her safety, but lingering to help with small repairs to the schoolhouse or simply to share a cup of coffee and conversation. Each visit deepened their connection, revealing new facets of the quiet rancher that Grace found increasingly compelling. She learned about his childhood in Missouri, his service in the Union Cavalry during the war, and his journey west with his brother. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Boston, her parents, and her dreams of someday opening her own school for girls. These conversations, casual on the surface, were woven through with an undercurrent of growing attraction that neither acknowledged directly. There were moments a hand lingering when passing a coffee cup, gazes held a heartbeat too long, the slight catch in Sam's voice when he said her name that suggested something deeper than friendship developing between them. But Grace reminded herself that she was still legally married, still vulnerable, still healing from the wounds Frank had inflicted. And Sam, for all his kindness, remained cautious, as if afraid to push her or perhaps to expose his own heart to potential pain. The first week of school passed without incident. The children responded well to Grace's teaching methods, and the parents seemed pleased with their children's enthusiasm. Even Mr. Thompson, who had been skeptical during her interview, grudgingly admitted that his granddaughter was taking to learning better than expected. It was Friday afternoon, after the children had been dismissed, when the fragile piece shattered. Grace was erasing the chalkboard when a shadow fell across the doorway. She turned, expecting Sam for his usual visit, but instead found herself face to face with Frank. He looked worse than when she'd last seen him, unshaven, eyes bloodshot, clothes rumpled. But the dangerous glint in his gaze was all too familiar. "Hello, wife," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "Quite the little setup you've got here." Grace's hand tightened on the chalk, her heart racing. "What do you want, Frank?" "What's mine," he replied, stepping into the schoolroom. "You've had your little adventure, now it's time to come home." "This is my home now," Grace said, edging toward the side door that led to her quarters. "I'm not going back with you." Frank's face darkened. "You don't have a choice, you're my wife." "Not for much longer," Grace retorted. "Judge Wilson will be hearing my petition for annulment in 2 weeks." This was evidently news to Frank. His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Annulment? On what grounds, you lying bitch?" "Fraud," Grace replied, lifting her chin. "You claim to be a successful rancher with substantial holdings. You claim to be a gentleman. Both claims were false." Frank lunged forward suddenly, grabbing Grace's arm with bruising force. "You think anyone will believe you, a hysterical woman who abandoned her husband? I've got friends in this town, Grace, people who know me." "Let go of me," Grace demanded, trying to wrench free, "or I'll scream and the entire town will hear." "Go ahead," Frank snarled. "Scream. By the time anyone gets here, you'll be on my horse heading home where you belong." Grace opened her mouth to do just that when a shadow appeared in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. "I believe the lady asked you to let go," Sam said, his voice quiet but hard as steel. Frank's grip tightened painfully on Grace's arm. "Stay out of this, Mitchell. This is between me and my wife." Sam stepped fully into the schoolroom, his stance relaxed but his eyes alert. "No, Blackburn, it's not anymore. Now let her go before I make you." For a tense moment, Grace thought Frank might try to fight. Then, with a muttered curse, he released her arm and stepped back. But his retreat was temporary. Grace could see the calculation in his eyes. "This isn't over," Frank warned, directing his words to Grace but keeping his eyes on Sam. "You're still my wife, the law's on my side." "The law protects citizens from violence," Sam replied evenly. "It doesn't give husbands the right to assault their wives. Now get out before I call the sheriff." Frank's gaze shifted between them, his expression ugly. "So that's how it is. You're whoring yourself out to Mitchell now." "I should have known." Before Grace could respond, Sam moved so quickly that Frank had no time to react. One moment Sam was across the room, the next he had Frank by the collar, slamming him against the wall hard enough to rattle the windows. "You will never speak to her like that again," Sam said, his voice deadly quiet. "You will never touch her, never threaten her, never so much as look in her direction. If you do, I will personally ensure that you regret it for the rest of your very short life. Do I make myself clear?" Frank, his face purpling with a combination of rage and restricted breathing, managed a jerky nod. Sam released him with a contemptuous shove toward the door. "Get out," Sam ordered, "and don't come back." Frank staggered to the doorway, then turned with a venomous glare. "This isn't over, Mitchell, not by a long shot." After he'd gone, Grace sagged against her desk, adrenaline draining away to leave her shaking. Sam was at her side instantly, his anger replaced by concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, gently examining the red marks on her arm where Frank had gripped her. "I'm all right," Grace assured him, though her voice trembled. "He just frightened me." Sam's expression darkened again. "He won't touch you again, I promise you that." "You can't be with me all the time," Grace pointed out, "and Frank won't give up easily." "No," Sam agreed, "he won't." He hesitated, then met her eyes directly. "Which is why I think you should consider coming back to the ranch until the annulment hearing." Grace blinked in surprise. "But the school is only a mile from my property," Sam finished. "You could ride in each day with Joseph or me. It would only be for 2 weeks until Judge Wilson rules on your case." The offer was tempting not just for the safety it offered, but for the chance to be near Sam daily. Yet Grace hesitated. "I don't want to impose, and people might talk." A smile touched the corner of Sam's mouth. "People already are talking, Grace. Half the town thinks we're courting." "And the other half?" Grace asked, her pulse quickening. Thinks we should be, Sam replied simply. The admission hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. Grace found herself unable to look away from Sam's blue eyes, which held a warmth she'd been too afraid to acknowledge until now. Sam, she began, uncertain what she wanted to say. He saved her from having to decide by stepping back slightly, restoring a more proper distance between them. Think about it, he said. The offer stands, whatever you decide. That night, alone in her small house, Grace found sleep elusive. Frank's appearance had shattered her sense of security, but it was Sam's words and the emotion behind them that truly kept her awake. Half the town thinks we're courting. Was that what was happening between them? This gradual, careful drawing together, this deepening connection that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. Grace hadn't come west looking for love. After Frank's betrayal, she'd sworn never to trust a man again. Yet here she was, lying awake thinking of Sam Mitchell's blue eyes and the gentle way he touched her cheek. A sudden noise outside her window jolted Grace from her thoughts. She sat up, straining to listen. It could be the wind or an animal. Or it could be Frank, returned to make good on his threats, another sound of scraping against the side of the house. Grace slipped from bed, heart pounding. The small house had no lock on the back door, an oversight she now cursed. She grabbed the fireplace poker and crept toward the main room, where the noise was coming from. A shadow passed across the window, and Grace tightened her grip on the poker, ready to defend herself. The back door handle turned slowly, then the door began to open. Grace raised the poker, prepared to strike. Grace. A familiar voice called softly, "It's Sam." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by confusion. "Sam, what are you doing here?" He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. In the dim moonlight, Grace could make out the serious set of his features. "I couldn't leave you here alone, not after what happened today. You've been outside all this time?" Grace asked, lowering the poker. Sam nodded. "I was going to stay on the porch, but I heard something in the trees behind the school. Probably just an animal, but I wanted to make sure you were safe." The thought of him standing guard outside her door, vigilant against danger, touched Grace deeply. "You can't stay out there all night." "I've slept in worse places," Sam replied with a slight shrug. Grace made a decision then perhaps impulsive, certainly risky, but in that moment utterly clear. "You can sleep here. On the floor, I mean, I have extra blankets." Sam hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against practicality. "People would talk." "People already are talking," Grace said, echoing his earlier words with a small smile. "Besides, no one needs to know. You can leave before dawn." After a moment's more consideration, Sam nodded. "All right, thank you." Grace retrieved blankets from the bedroom, and together they arranged a makeshift bed on the floor near the fireplace. The domesticity of the task felt strangely natural, as if they'd been sharing such moments for years rather than days. "I'll see you in the morning then," Grace said, suddenly shy as she prepared to return to her bedroom. "Good night, Grace," Sam replied, his voice soft in the darkness. She paused at her bedroom door. "Sam, thank you for everything." His silhouette nodded in the moonlight. "You don't have to thank me, Grace. I'm here because I want to be." The simple honesty of his words followed her into sleep, wrapping around her like a protective embrace. Morning came with golden light filtering through the curtains and the aroma of coffee brewing. Grace dressed quickly and emerged to find Sam tending the stove, his hair damp from washing at the pump outside. "Good morning," he greeted her, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "I hope I didn't wake you." "No," Grace assured him, accepting the offered cup. "I usually rise early on Saturdays." "There's so much to prepare for the coming week." They settled at the small table, the domestic scene both unfamiliar and oddly right. Sam looked relaxed in the morning light, the usual vigilance in his eyes softened to a warmer attentiveness. "Have you thought about what I said?" he asked after a moment. "About staying at the ranch until the hearing," Grace nodded. "I have, and I've decided to accept your offer if it still stands." Relief washed over Sam's features. "It does. We can move your things today if you'd like." "Today would be good," Grace agreed. "The sooner the better, I think." They spent the morning packing Grace's few belongings and making arrangements for her temporary absence. She wrote a note for Mrs. Hayes explaining the situation, emphasizing that she would continue teaching during the week. Sam sent Joseph to inform Sheriff Donovan of the change, ensuring the lawman knew where to find Grace if needed. By early afternoon, They were ready to depart. Sam loaded Grace's trunk onto his wagon while she took a final look around the small house that had been her first taste of independence. "We'll have you back here before you know it," Sam assured her, misreading her wistful expression. "Once the annulment is granted, Frank will have no legal claim on you." "I know," Grace said, smiling to reassure him. "It's just strange how quickly life can change. A week ago, I was terrified and alone. Now," she glanced at Sam, "now I'm neither of those things." The ride to the Mitchell Ranch passed pleasantly, with Sam pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. Grace found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the wagon, the tension of the past days gradually easing from her shoulders. Joseph met them at the ranch, his young face alight with barely concealed excitement at having Grace return. "Fixed up the spare room real nice, madam," he informed her proudly. "Put fresh flowers in there, too." "Thank you, Joseph," Grace said warmly. "That was very thoughtful." The ranch seemed more welcoming than ever as Sam helped her down from the wagon. Perhaps it was the knowledge that she was choosing to be here rather than fleeing to the only refuge available. Or perhaps it was simply that, in some inexplicable way, this place had begun to feel like home. The days fell into a comfortable pattern. Each morning, Sam would drive Grace to the schoolhouse in the wagon, returning at day's end to bring her back to the ranch. The arrangement raised eyebrows in town, but with Mrs. Rodriguez's vocal support and Reverend Hayes's tacit approval, even the more conservative members of the community accepted it as a necessary precaution given Frank's threatening behavior. Frank himself made no further appearances, though Sheriff Donovan reported he'd been seen drinking heavily at the saloon, making dark comments about settling scores. The sheriff had warned him to stay away from the school and the Mitchell Ranch, but no one believed the matter was truly resolved. In the evenings, after supper, Grace and Sam would often sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the distant mountains while discussing everything from literature to ranching techniques. These conversations revealed the depth of Sam's intelligence and the breadth of his knowledge self-taught through years of reading during lonely winters. "I never took you for such a scholar," Grace teased one evening as they debated the merits of Emerson versus Thoreau. Sam smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Not much else to do during blizzards in Missouri. My father thought reading was a waste of time, but my mother smuggled books to me and my brother." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Grace said softly. "She was," Sam agreed, his smile fading. "I wish you could have met her." The casual comment hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither was quite ready to address, for it suggested a shared future that remained uncertain while Grace was still legally tied to Frank. The day of the hearing arrived with a sky the color of hammered copper, a storm brewing to the west, though the air remained still and heavy with anticipation. Grace dressed with care in her best dress, now freshly laundered and pressed by Mrs. Hayes's skilled hands. Her hair she arranged simply but neatly, wanting to present an image of respectability and stability to the judge. Sam waited for her on the porch, similarly dressed in his best, a dark suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. He looked different, almost a stranger, until he smiled at her approach and became simply Sam again. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice carrying a note Grace hadn't heard before, a deeper timbre that sent warmth coursing through her. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You look very handsome yourself." The drive to town was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about the day ahead. Grace found herself alternating between hope and dread: hope that Judge Wilson would grant the annulment, dread that Frank would create a scene or worse. The territorial court was held in the largest building in Cottonwood Creek, a combination town hall and courtroom with impressive, for the territory, wooden columns flanking the entrance. Already a crowd had gathered, this being the most interesting event in town for months. Inside, the courtroom was arranged with rough wooden benches for spectators and a raised platform where Judge Wilson, a stern-faced man with impressive side whiskers, presided. At a table to one side sat Reverend Hayes, who would be testifying on Grace's behalf. To Grace's surprise, Mrs. Rodriguez was also present, along with several other respected townspeople, and there, slouched in a chair near the front, was Frank, sober for once, dressed in what passed for his best clothes, a sullen expression on his face. He looked up as Grace entered with Sam, his eyes narrowing with hatred. The proceedings began formally, with Judge Wilson explaining the purpose of the hearing and the legal standards for granting an annulment. Grace listened intently, trying to gauge from his tone whether he was sympathetic to her case. When called to testify, Grace recounted her courtship with Frank, his representation of himself as a successful rancher and businessman, his promises of a comfortable home and respectable life in the territory. Then she described the reality she'd found upon arrival: a dilapidated cabin, no substantial property, and a husband who spent what little money they had on alcohol and gambling. Frank's attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Simmons, cross-examined her aggressively, suggesting she'd known exactly what she was getting into and had only fled when the reality of frontier life proved too harsh for her delicate Eastern sensibilities. "Is it not true, Mrs. Blackburn," Simmons pressed, "that you left your husband the moment life became difficult? That rather than honoring your vows for better or worse, you abandoned your marriage at the first sign of hardship?" Grace straightened in her seat. "No, sir, that is not true. I endured months of deception, drunkenness, and violence. I left when I feared for my life." "Violence," Simmons repeated skeptically. "Yet you never reported this alleged abuse to the sheriff." "Frank made it clear what would happen if I sought help," Grace replied steadily. "And given his connections in town, I had no reason to believe I would be protected." The questioning continued in this vein until Judge Wilson finally intervened. "I believe we've established Mrs. Blackburn's position, Mr. Simmons. Let's move on." Reverend Hayes testified next, describing Frank's reputation in the community and confirming that the property he claimed to own was, in fact, a small claim shared with 3 partners, not the substantial ranch he had described to Grace. Mrs. Rodriguez followed, recounting an incident she had witnessed in which Frank had publicly berated and threatened Grace early in their marriage. Throughout the testimony, Frank grew increasingly agitated, shifting in his seat and muttering to his attorney. When it was his turn to testify, he presented himself as a hard-working man whose Eastern wife couldn't adapt to frontier life. "I never laid a hand on her," he declared, looking directly at Grace with such conviction that she almost questioned her own memories. "She left because life out here was harder than she expected. Now she's trying to ruin my reputation to justify breaking her vows." Judge Wilson listened impassively, giving no indication of his leanings. When all testimony had been heard, he announced he would consider the evidence and deliver his ruling the following morning. The crowd dispersed slowly, buzzing with speculation. Sam guided Grace through the throng, keeping a protective hand at the small of her back. "You did well in there," he murmured for her ears alone. "Don't let him make you doubt yourself." Grace nodded, grateful for Sam's steady presence. But as they reached the street, Frank intercepted them, his expression tight with barely controlled rage. "Enjoy your victory lap," he snarled at Grace. "It won't last. Even if that old fool grants the annulment, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of woman you really are." Sam stepped forward, placing himself between Grace and Frank. "That's enough, Blackburn. The hearing's over. Go home." Frank's gaze shifted to Sam, hatred blazing in his eyes. "This is all your fault, Mitchell. You turned my wife against me. You'll regret that." "Is that a threat?" Sam asked quietly. "It's a promise," Frank replied, then turned and stalked away, shouldering roughly past Sheriff Donovan, who had approached at the first sign of confrontation. "Everything all right here?" the sheriff asked, watching Frank's retreating figure. "Fine, Sheriff," Sam replied. "Just words." Donovan nodded, though his expression remained concerned. "I'll keep an eye on him. Blackburn's been making some troubling comments at the saloon lately, talking about teaching lessons and such." "We'll be careful," Sam assured him. "Grace will be staying at my ranch until the judge's ruling tomorrow." "Good," Donovan said. "I'd feel better knowing she's not alone. I'll ride by later, make sure everything's quiet." The storm that had threatened all day broke as they drove back to the ranch, rain pelting the wagon and turning the road to mud. By the time they arrived, both were soaked, despite Sam's attempt to shelter Grace with his coat. Joseph met them at the barn, taking the horses while Sam helped Grace to the house. Inside, they stood dripping in the entryway, suddenly laughing at their bedraggled appearance. You look like a drowned cat, Sam teased, reaching out to brush a strand of wet hair from Grace's cheek. The touch lingered, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. Grace felt her breath catch, the laughter fading as something else entirely took its place. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the only sound the drumming of rain on the roof and the quickening of her heart. Then Sam stepped back, breaking the spell. "You should change into dry clothes," he said, his voice rough. "I'll build up the fire." Grace nodded and retreated to her room, her skin still tingling where Sam had touched her. As she changed into a simple dress, she found herself examining her feelings with a clarity that had been lacking before. She cared for Sam deeply, perhaps even loved him. The realization should have frightened her after her experience with Frank, but instead it filled her with a strange, quiet certainty. Sam was nothing like Frank. He had shown her only respect, kindness, and protection, asking nothing in return, but was she ready for such feelings? And even if she were, what future could they have while the shadow of her marriage to Frank still loomed? When she returned to the main room, Sam had changed as well and was stoking a roaring fire in the hearth. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Better?" he asked. "Much," Grace replied, settling into the rocking chair he had brought for her from the ranch, "though I'm afraid my hair will take hours to dry properly." Sam regarded her for a moment, then crossed to a cabinet and removed a hairbrush. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her damp tresses. The request was so unexpected that Grace could only nod. Sam moved behind the rocking chair and gently began to brush her hair, his touch careful and respectful. It was an intimate act, yet there was nothing improper in it, just a simple offering of care that moved Grace deeply. "My mother used to do this for my sister," Sam said quietly. "She said it was how women showed they cared for each other." "It's soothing," Grace murmured, her eyes drifting closed as the brush moved rhythmically through her hair. "Thank you." They remained like that for several minutes, the only sounds the crackling fire and the steady sweep of the brush. When Sam finally set the brush aside, Grace felt more relaxed than she had in days, despite the uncertainty still hanging over her. "Grace," Sam said, coming around to face her, "there's something I need to say before tomorrow." She looked up at him, seeing the resolve in his blue eyes. "What is it?" Sam knelt before the rocking chair, bringing them to eye level. "Whatever the judge decides tomorrow, I want you to know that you have a place here, not just temporarily, but permanently if you want it." Grace's heart began to race. "Sam, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care for you," he replied simply. "More than I thought possible after Jenny. I know the timing is all wrong with everything you've been through with Frank, and if you need time, I understand. But I wanted you to know where I stand." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a profound relief and joy she hadn't expected to feel again. "I care for you too, Sam, so much that it frightens me sometimes." A smile broke across his face, transforming his features in the firelight. "Does that mean you'll stay?" Once all this is settled, Grace reached out to touch his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of his evening beard. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll stay." Sam caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, a gesture so tender that it brought fresh tears to Grace's eyes. "That's all I needed to hear," he said softly. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. Sam rose quickly, hand instinctively moving to the revolver he'd laid aside earlier. "Who's there?" he called, motioning for Grace to move away from the door. "Sheriff Donovan," came the reply. "Sorry to disturb you, Mitchell, but we've got trouble." Sam opened the door to reveal the sheriff, rain-soaked and grim-faced. "What's happened?" Sam asked, ushering him inside. "Frank Blackburn," Donovan replied, nodding a greeting to Grace. "He's gone on a tear through town, making threats against both of you. Said something about settling things once and for all. I've got men looking for him, but he gave them the slip." "You think he's heading here?" Sam asked, voice tightening. "Could be," Donovan confirmed. "Thought you should be warned. I can leave a deputy." "No need," Sam interrupted. "We'll be ready if he comes, but thank you for the warning, Sheriff." After Donovan departed with a promise to continue searching, Sam turned to Grace, his expression grave. "I want you to go to your room and lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "What are you going to do?" Grace asked, fear clawing at her throat. "Wait," Sam replied simply, "and be ready." Grace obeyed reluctantly, locking herself in the bedroom but unable to rest. She paced, listening intently for any sound beyond the rain that continued to pound against the roof. Through the window, she could see only darkness and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the yard. An hour passed, then another. The storm began to abate, the rain softening to a gentle patter. Grace had just begun to hope that Frank had been found by the sheriff when a gunshot shattered the night. She rushed to the window in time to see Sam dash from the porch toward the barn, revolver in hand. The yard was briefly illuminated by another flash of lightning, revealing two figures struggling near the corral. Joseph and a larger man Grace recognized instantly as Frank. "Sam," Joseph's voice carried through the rain. "He's got a gun." Grace's heart froze. Without thinking, she unlocked her door and ran toward the main entrance, driven by a desperate need to help. As she reached the front room, the door burst open to reveal Frank, rain-soaked and wild-eyed, a revolver in his hand. "Hello, wife," he snarled, water dripping from his hat. "Thought you could hide from me, did you?" Grace backed away, searching frantically for a weapon. "Frank, please, this won't solve anything." "Oh, it'll solve everything," Frank replied, advancing on her. "Once you're gone, I'll be free to start over. No wife, no obligations, just me and a fresh start." The implication of his words chilled Grace to the bone. He meant to kill her. "The sheriff is looking for you," she said, playing for time. "He knows you threatened me." Frank laughed harshly. "The sheriff's searching the wrong side of town. By the time they figure it out, I'll be long gone." He raised the revolver. "Nothing personal, Grace. You're just in my way." "Drop it, Blackburn." Sam's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He stood in the doorway, his own revolver aimed steadily at Frank. "It's over." Frank whirled, bringing his gun to bear on Sam instead. "Mitchell, should have known you'd turn up. Coming to rescue your whore." Sam's expression hardened, but his voice remained calm. "Put the gun down, now." For a moment it seemed Frank might comply. Then his face twisted with hatred and he squeezed the trigger. Two shots rang out simultaneously. Frank staggered backward, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. Sam lurched against the doorframe, his left arm hanging awkwardly. "Sam." Grace cried, rushing to his side as Frank collapsed to the floor. "I'm all right," Sam assured her, though his face was pale with pain. "Just grazed me." Joseph appeared in the doorway, eyes widening at the scene before him. "Mr. Mitchell, you're hurt." "See to Blackburn," Sam ordered, allowing Grace to help him to a chair. Joseph knelt beside Frank's still form, checking for signs of life. After a moment, he looked up, his young face solemn. "He's dead, sir." Grace felt a complex wave of emotions: relief, horror, and a strange, guilty sense of freedom. Frank was gone. The threat he represented was over. But a man had died, a life had ended in violence before her eyes. "Go fetch the sheriff," Sam told Joseph. "Ride careful in this weather." As Joseph hurried out, Grace turned her attention to Sam's wound. She cut away his sleeve to reveal a deep graze across his upper arm, bleeding freely but not life-threatening. "You could have been killed," she said, her hands shaking as she cleaned the wound. "So could you," Sam replied, his gaze intense. "When I saw him holding that gun on you." He shook his head, unable to continue. Grace paused in her ministrations, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what had nearly happened and what had happened instead. "Frank is dead," she said, the words hollow in her mouth. "I should feel something, shouldn't I? Grief or something. He was my husband." "He was going to kill you," Sam reminded her gently. "You're allowed to feel relieved that he can't hurt you anymore. Is it over now?" Grace asked, completing the bandage on Sam's arm. "Truly over." Sam captured her hand in his, holding it against his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "Yes," he said softly, "it's over. You don't have to run anymore, Grace, not ever again." The simple words, "you don't have to run anymore," broke something open inside Grace. Tears came suddenly, violently, years of fear and tension releasing in a flood. Sam pulled her against his chest, his good arm wrapping securely around her, holding her safe while she wept. By the time Sheriff Donovan arrived with his deputies, Grace had regained her composure. The official investigation was brief but thorough. Joseph confirmed that Frank had ambushed him at the barn, demanding to know where Grace was. The young ranch hand's shout had alerted Sam, leading to the confrontation in the house. With multiple witnesses to Frank's threats earlier in the day, and the evident fact that he had broken into the Mitchell ranch armed, the sheriff quickly ruled the shooting justified self-defense. Frank's body was removed, to be buried the next day in the small cemetery outside town. You should get that arm looked at properly, Donovan advised Sam as he prepared to leave. Doc Evans can come out in the morning. Sam nodded, though Grace could see he was in considerable pain despite his stoic expression. We'll be at the courthouse tomorrow for the judge's ruling. He can see to it then. After the sheriff and his men departed, a heavy silence fell over the house. Joseph, sensing the need for privacy, mumbled something about checking the horses and disappeared into the night. You should rest, Grace told Sam, concerned by his increasing pallor. You've lost blood. I'll be fine, he insisted, though he allowed her to help him to his bedroom, a space Grace had never entered before. It was simply furnished like the rest of the house, but undeniably masculine, from the heavy quilt on the bed to the books stacked on the bedside table. A daguerreotype on the dresser caught Grace's eye, a family portrait showing a younger Sam in uniform, standing beside an older couple and a young man who resembled him. My parents and brother, Sam explained, noticing her interest. Taken before I left for the war. Grace helped him settle on the bed, propping pillows behind him to support his injured arm. Can I get you anything? Water? Something for the pain? Sam caught her hand as she turned to go. Stay, he said simply, just for a while. Grace hesitated only briefly before settling beside him on the edge of the bed. There was nothing improper in the request, not after all they had endured together. What happens now? She asked quietly. Sam's blue eyes held her steadily. That depends on the judge's ruling tomorrow. And on what you want, Grace. What I want, Grace repeated thoughtfully. For so long, all I wanted was to be free of Frank. Now that I am. She trailed off, searching for the words to express the complex emotions swirling within her. Now you can choose, Sam finished for her. Whatever future you want, it's yours to decide. Grace looked at him, this man who had risked his life to protect her, who had offered sanctuary when she had nowhere else to turn, who had shown her what true strength and gentleness could be. The choice, she realized, was already made. I want to stay, she said softly. Here with you, if that's still what you want. Sam's face transformed with a slow, radiant smile. It's what I want more than anything in this world, Grace Kelly. He reached up with his good arm to cup her cheek, drawing her gently toward him. Grace went willingly, her heart racing as their lips met in a first, tender kiss, a promise of the future they would build together. The morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. Grace dressed carefully for the courthouse, conscious that this would be her first public appearance since Frank's death. The town would be watching, judging, speculating. She wanted to present an image of dignified composure. Sam, his arm properly bandaged by Joseph's unexpectedly skilled hands, waited for her on the porch. He looked pale but determined, his jaw set with the same resolve she had come to depend on. Ready? He asked as she joined him. Grace nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. Ready. The courthouse was packed when they arrived, news of Frank's death having spread through town like wildfire. A hush fell as Grace and Sam entered, followed by curious whispers and not-so-subtle pointing. Grace kept her head high, refusing to be cowed by the scrutiny. Judge Wilson called the court to order promptly at 9 o'clock. His stern countenance revealed nothing as he addressed the assembled crowd. Before delivering my ruling on the petition for annulment, I must acknowledge the changed circumstances since yesterday's hearing. The death of Mr. Frank Blackburn, while tragic, does not alter the legal considerations before this court. He paused, shuffling papers before him. Having reviewed the testimony and evidence presented, I find that Mrs. Grace Kelly Blackburn has established sufficient grounds for annulment on the basis of fraud. Mr. Blackburn demonstrably misrepresented his financial situation and property holdings prior to the marriage, inducing Mrs. Blackburn to enter into the union under false pretenses. Grace felt a wave of relief wash over her, so powerful that she swayed slightly in her seat. Sam's hand found hers, squeezing gently in silent support. Therefore, Judge Wilson continued, the marriage between Grace Kelly and Frank Blackburn is hereby declared null and void. Mrs. Kelly may resume her maiden name and is free to pursue her future as she sees fit. He banged his gavel once. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in chatter as the judge departed. Mrs. Hayes was the first to reach Grace, enveloping her in a warm embrace. "It's over, my dear," she whispered. "You're free now." Others followed Mrs. Rodriguez, offering practical advice about legally securing her teaching position, Reverend Hayes expressing relief at the just outcome, even Mr. Thompson gruffly acknowledging that things had worked out for the best. Through it all, Sam remained at Grace's side, a steady, protective presence. Only when the crowd began to disperse did he draw her slightly aside, his expression serious. "There's something I need to ask you," he said quietly. "And I know it's too soon, especially with everything that's happened. But I need you to know my intentions." Grace felt her heart quicken. "What is it, Sam?" He took both her hands in his, heedless of the few remaining spectators. "I love you, Grace Kelly. I think I've loved you since that first day when you stood up to Frank with nothing but courage and determination. I know you need time, and I'm prepared to wait as long as necessary. But when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I want to marry you." Grace felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Oh, Sam," she whispered, "I love you too, and yes, I will marry you not today or tomorrow, but soon, when we've both had time to heal." The smile that broke across Sam's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He raised her hands to his lips, kissing them reverently. That's all I needed to hear. 6 months later, on a perfect spring day with wildflowers carpeting the hillsides, Grace Kelly became Grace Mitchell in a simple ceremony at the Cottonwood Creek Church. She wore a new dress of ivory silk, ordered specially from San Francisco, and carried a bouquet of desert blooms gathered by Joseph that morning. Sam waited for her at the altar, tall and handsome in a new suit, his blue eyes alight with love as she walked toward him on Reverend Hayes's arm. The church was filled with the community that had embraced Grace as their teacher and friend, the children from her school, their parents, the townspeople who had supported her through her darkest days. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Hayes began, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other the strength, courage, and love to build a new life together." As Grace recited her vows, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west seeking a new beginning, endured hardship and fear, and emerged stronger than she had believed possible. In Sam, she had found not a savior, but a partner, someone who respected her independence, even while offering protection, who valued her mind as well as her heart. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Hayes declared. "Mr. Mitchell, you may kiss your bride." Sam's kiss was gentle yet full of promise, a pledge of all the days and years to come. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, Grace felt a sense of completion, of having finally found her true home. The celebration that followed at the Mitchell Ranch lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed the entire county. Joseph, serving as best man with obvious pride, made a surprisingly eloquent toast to the newlyweds that brought tears to many eyes. As the sun began to set, casting the land in gold and crimson, Sam led Grace away from the festivities to the porch of what was now their home. In the distance, the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the sky. "Happy?" Sam asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I can hardly believe we're here. Sometimes I think I'll wake up and find it was all a dream." Sam's arm tightened around her. "Not a dream," he assured her. "This is real, Grace. You and me building a life together." Grace turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "You know, that first day when you found me hiding behind that wagon, I was so afraid. I thought I'd never feel safe again." "And now," Sam asked, his blue eyes tender in the fading light, "now I know that safety isn't the absence of fear," Grace said thoughtfully. "It's having the courage to face whatever comes, knowing you're not alone." She smiled up at him. "You told me I didn't have to run anymore, and you were right. I found something worth staying for." Sam lowered his head to kiss her, a kiss that spoke of passion and tenderness, of promises kept and a future filled with possibility. Behind them, the sound of music and laughter floated on the evening air, a celebration not just of their marriage, but of the journey that had brought them together. And as twilight deepened into night, Grace and Sam Mitchell stood wrapped in each other's arms, gazing out at the land that had tested them, challenged them, and ultimately blessed them with the greatest gift of all. A love strong enough to overcome every obstacle, brave enough to face any danger, and true enough to last a lifetime. 1 year later, Grace stood on the porch of the Mitchell Ranch, watching as Sam and Joseph worked with the spring calves in the corral. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach, where their first child had just begun to make its presence known. The past year had brought changes to the ranch, a new wing added to the house, a thriving vegetable garden that was Grace's pride, additional cattle that made the Mitchell spread one of the most prosperous in the territory. But the most significant changes were less visible: the deepening of love between Grace and Sam, the growing confidence with which she balanced her roles as wife and teacher, the sense of belonging that had finally replaced the fear that had driven her west. As if sensing her thoughts, Sam looked up from his work and smiled, that special smile reserved only for her. Grace returned it, feeling the now familiar warmth that his gaze always kindled within her. She had come to Arizona territory seeking a new beginning, never imagining the trials she would face or the joy she would find. She had tried to run from danger, only to discover that sometimes the greatest courage lies in standing still, in claiming your place in the world, in opening your heart to love even after it's been battered by betrayal. "You don't have to run anymore," Sam had told her on that fateful day when he found her hiding behind an overturned wagon, Frank's threats ringing in her ears. He had been right. She didn't have to run anymore. She was home.